Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully having an amazing day. Let's kick this video off with Nvidia, specifically the fact that RTX 40 may launch much earlier than anticipated. For many, we've been saying that RTX 40 will launch around the September period. However, some interesting rumours have sprouted up thanks to Kopiti7 Kimi. I'll of course link their Twitter account in the description of the video. We'll discuss specs in a moment as well. But according to Kopiti, basically we will see these GPUs launch Q3 early. Now of course this does not exactly narrow it down to the day and the month, but it does give us a great indication that we could be seeing these cards launch as early as July, or possibly as late, quote-unquote, as August. Quite honestly, in the world of tech over the past several months, there has been a lot of shuffling backwards and forwards with AMD, Nvidia and Intel. And quite frankly, I think roadmaps going forward are going to be shook up quite substantially. Not necessarily for Zen 4, after all it's, almost about to launch, but for Zen 5 onwards. And this goes for comparable products from other companies as well, whether it be CPU or GPU, there will be some major changes. I won't go over all of the specifications, but I will of course link Grayman as well as Kopiti's accounts in the video description, along with a nice comparison piece from WCCF Tech, which kind of puts all of these into a rather nice table. But we can see here that AD102 is going to feature 144 SMs with a grand total of 18,432 CUDA cores. Now this is most likely going to be the RTX 4090, assuming Nvidia doesn't decide to do a switcheroo with the naming convention. Naturally, this will also feature 384-bit bus. Most likely, this is going to also mean a grand total of 24 gigabytes of memory. And I do think that AMD and Nvidia are going to want to sit at 24 gigabytes for the Halo SKUs. If you've watched my recent Nave 31 video, you'll know that I actually believe that the specifications of 16 gigabytes for N31 were incorrect, and we will actually be seeing a larger increase. But moving down the stack a little bit, let's quickly discuss AD103, which features 84 SMs and 10,752 CUDA cores. Possibly this will be the RTX 4080, 256-bit memory bus, and of course 16 gigabytes of memory. This is again assuming that we're not looking at any pro variants or any major changes last minute from Nvidia. They are pretty good at pulling sneakies on the audience. Now, as for the performance targets of RTX 4090 and 4080 and other SKUs, well, that's where things start to get quite interesting. To my personal understanding at this stage, RTX 4090s, or I suppose it would be more accurate to say AD102s, are now being tested and bought up, and they are basically in the hands of AIBs. And this means, of course, that the AIBs are starting to test the hardware. And compared to an RTX 3090, I'm hearing that we're looking at around a 2.1 times increase in performance. But this does not seem to be the highest end SKU at 600 watts, according to multiple people that I've spoken to. Instead, this seems to be substantially less power that's being ploughed into the card. So there is, however, a variant which is 600 watts, and that allegedly is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 2.5 times, possibly 2.4 times faster than an RTX 3090. We'll have a quick look at how this would compare against previous generations in just a moment, but in terms of SM increase, assuming the information we have for AD102 has been correct thus far, we're looking at around a 70% increase. Now I'm going to quickly take Tech Power Up as a nice, nice roundup of performance across multiple generations. And if we compare a GTX 1080 Ti against the RTX 2080 Ti, to use Nvidia's new way of calling the card, well, we can see that the 1080 Ti in Far Cry 5, I'm sorry, I can't resist, gets around 60 FPS. I'm going to round up and down for everyone's sanity. Meanwhile, the 2080 Ti is getting 82 192, and the RTX 3080 is 104. And if we now look at the Strix overclocked variant, we can see a couple of different versions here, which is why I've actually chosen this one. The 3090 goes up to 480 watts, and we're looking at around 121 FPS or 120 with its default reference power. And this can be pretty much said across the board. Something like Doom Eternal, by the way, just to be clear, we're only looking at the 4K results. The 2080 Ti 116.7 compared to 70 FPS of the 1080. So that's a pretty good increase. It's not quite 2 times, but it's certainly not bad, as the term would say. And yeah, we can see a pretty meaningful leap here with the 3090. The problem is, though, when we're referring to performance gains, if we go back to, let's say, Maxwell, and then we compare against, let's say, Pascal, there was pretty much everything that just aligned with that. Like, the planets really did align. If you were PC gaming back in the 980 to 1080 era, you know exactly what I talked about. There was a substantial improvement in architecture. Obviously, Maxwell to Pascal, basically everything just went kablamo. Further to this, there were also major improvements, of course, in the node that was being used compared to the two architectures. So, you know, we have seen substantial increases in the past. Like, Nvidia really did hammer home the improvement of Pascal over Maxwell. I think even, and this is from memory, there were even like marketing things of where they were saying like Pascal is 2 980s or something along those lines. I'm sure we can throw that in with editing, but yeah, you get the idea. It was pretty substantial as an increase. So honestly, I do feel that this GPU generation, it is crazy. Like, the amount of performance here is crazy, it is nuts, but it also makes logical sense because I feel that we need it. Like, games are becoming increasingly more demanding. And the other question, of course, is what about ray tracing? With N31, Navi 31, there is a lot more room, perhaps a lot more scope for ray tracing improvement if we compare from one generation, Navi 21, for example, to 31, because RDNA 2's ray tracing performances, well, I suppose the best way of describing it is abysmal. So obviously AMD can make much better generation upon generation claims, perhaps than Nvidia, but I still think that there are going to be some major improvements here. Quite honestly, there is so many rumors concerning both of these generation of cards, and I feel that both AMD and Nvidia are pushing out controlled leaks also to kind of build hype as well. The real question perhaps isn't necessarily just the flagships for me, because obviously, if you're comparing, you know, generation upon generation of cards that are cost like $2,000 or whatever, that's great, but the majority of people just can't afford that, or perhaps just don't want to pay it just out of principle, which I can understand for certain. But we can start to imagine, though, an RTX 4060 or a 4070, which should handily be able to outperform a 3080, for example. It's going to be very curious, I feel, for the next generation of products. But anyway, let's leave that there because, well, we could discuss Nvidia for a long-ass time. I guess we are going to continue to discuss them, as there is another very small piece of news that I'd like to bring to your attention. And this is perhaps more interesting if you're an Nintendo and Nvidia fan. I will link the WCCF article, which has actually discussed this in depth. But basically, there is a new job ad for a game console developer tools engineer. I think really this is one of those kind of job titles which basically says everything on the tin. And you can read the description here. Are you passionate about 3D graphics, GPUs, low-level, close-to-hardware programming? And naturally they are pushing here for graphics developer tools for a game console. Now, this is not outright stating it is for the Nintendo Switch or for Nintendo, but Nvidia are not producing the chips for the PlayStation hardware, the Xbox hardware, so really and truly it does seem to be a Switch successor. Again, multiple times on the channel I've discussed the fact that, you know, I leaked the Switch 4K or Switch Pro, whatever it ends up being called. I basically think there's been some major redesigns, honestly, of the console several times over at this point. This has been essentially confirmed by the Nvidia hack, leak, whatever you want to call it, where they basically showed, code that seemed to be implied to be from Nintendo, and it obviously was a new graphics architecture. And again, this is most likely going to be DLSS enabled as well, which clearly will give a lot of benefits for a games console. And you can actually argue too that a lot of Nintendo's IPs, for example Zelda, Mario, and so on, with their art style, they perhaps would even be a better candidate for DLSS. It'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. The final thing is just a real quick update concerning Zen 4, Raphael. There have been some rumours that we could see a 24-core variant, and this has basically popped up from, I believe, a Chinese website. I'll leave a link to it in the video description, along with, again, WCCF Tech. They just seem to have been on the ball when it comes to the news over the last day or so, because I've been away for just took a break from the channel just to try and rest up a little bit. But basically the 7950X is 24 cores, at least according to this. Now I have to say, I don't believe that this is true. I think that the highest end Zen 4 SKU is actually 16 cores. And I have actually previously mentioned on the channel a couple of times that I had heard AMD were working on a 24 and a 32 core variant, or at least considering it, but it never seemed to enter, even being considered for mass production. Basically it was considered early on, to my understanding anyway, and then scrapped. Now, I could be wrong, and I would love to be wrong. I would love there to be a 24 or a 32 core SKU, but I don't think this is true. A 24 is the highest end anyway. Now that we know that the CCX or CCD, whatever, I suppose at this point they're basically interchangeable, is only 8 cores. 24 doesn't make sense, really. To my personal understanding, we will see an increase in core count in Zen 5 for the Ryzen series, so that is probably going to be up to 32 cores. So I don't think that we are looking at 24 cores for Ryzen 7000 series. I would love to be wrong, guys. I would love to be wrong, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think, though, that AMD are going to bolster their core count up to the stratosphere. Well, I suppose 32 cores is not exactly the stratosphere, but I think that it does make a lot of logical sense, because at this stage, obviously, Intel are starting to catch up. I know that's probably going to make some of you groan, but it is true. Intel have done a really good job with Alder Lake, and Raptor Lake is not, it's not that, it's not exactly a complete revolution. It's not an entire new architecture. It's basically taking Alder Lake, tweaking it a little bit, and again, IPC gains around 10-ish%, give or take, depending on who you ask at this point. I mean, some of my sources are telling me it could be up to 12-13%, one even said 15%, others are saying it's 8%. I'm going to split the difference, say about 10%, with some clock frequency improvements as well. But compare that to the, Zen 4. I think Zen 4 will do pretty damn well. So AMD doesn't really need to concern itself too much against Raptor Lake. Future architectures from AMD and Intel, though, they're going to really just go all out. They have to. But with that said, thank you very much for checking out this video. If you have enjoyed it, well, you know what to do. It's YouTube. And I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.